Dota 2 and League of Legends are on their way out of the limelight, and the PC MOBA genre as we know it might be going with them. A lot of reasons have been cited for their dwindling popularity. Some examples include, but are not limited to, a towering learning cliff, an aging player base, and more accessible competition. But I think there's a lot more behind the fall of these PC gaming titans that people aren't even touching on yet. So join me as I take a look at the reality behind the downfall of Dota and League. And to do this, we need to start from the beginning with Warcraft 3 and Defense of the Ancients. As you probably already know, the original Dota was a Warcraft 3 mod that got a lot of popularity, and it kept growing with each update from the game's original creators. And its core mechanics would become the backbone of an entire genre. Sure, it wasn't the first of its kind, but it was the one that caught on. Anyway, the original Defense of the Ancients, or Dota mod, would become the gold standard for the genre that people eventually dubbed the MOBA, which was short for Multiplayer Online Battle Arena. Now, some of you are old enough to get annoyed by this term, but trust me, we'll talk more about this later. And every MOBA that followed Dota used that general framework to a degree. League of Legends, Dota 2, which is the game's direct successor, Heroes of Newerth, Heroes of the Storm, heck, even fucking Pokemon Unite. All of these games follow a framework that Dota first created in 2003. Over 2 decades ago. The MOBA framework that was the gold standard is old and outdated, and I can tell you why with just 4 letters: W, A, S, and D. Because Dota was a mod for Warcraft 3, it was designed to play like Warcraft 3. It had the limitations of the game's engine, you were more or less locked to an overhead camera, and perhaps bigger than anything, by default, you had to control your hero with your mouse. And most of the MOBAs that followed used that framework: overhead camera, mouse controls, and similar keybind setups like QWER for skills. And because games like Dota 2 and League played similarly to Warcraft 3, there were people that opted to dub the genre as ARTS, or Action Real-Time Strategy Games, but that name simply didn't catch on. MOBA just became the more broadly accepted term. Anyway, to people who've already been playing video games for decades, controlling your movement with your mouse might not sound like a big deal, but it's undeniable that most games these days use WASD for movement and the mouse for interaction, and it plays a bigger role than you might think when it comes to learning how to play games within the genre. Pick up any game that was released since 2010, and more likely than not, to move your character, you're gonna have to use your WASD keys. Gamers kinda just accepted this as the standard control setup somewhere down the line, and now you can tell if someone's a gamer just based on where their fingers go on their keyboard when they sit down on their desk. But you can probably tell from a glance because of the undeniable smell and signs of autism. That is to say that WASD controls are intuitive because modern games chose to adapt them as the primary default control setup. But you might be thinking that this is a bit of a stretch. There are tons of popular games that don't require you to use WASD to move. Perhaps most recently there's Baldur's Gate 3, which doesn't require you to use your keyboard to move your party around while also giving you an overhead camera. And there are also titles like the Civilization series and The Sims. But the thing is, these aren't esports titles. Look at every game featured in the 2024 Esports World Cup that were designed to accommodate mouse and keyboard. And if you're wondering why Apex Legends has an asterisk on it, it's because controller aim assist is stupid in that game. Anyway, notice that there are only 4 titles that don't use WASD by default. League and Dota, of course, but also TFT, which is an offshoot of League, and StarCraft, which is the only RTS and the sister game of Warcraft, which is ultimately what the MOBA genre control setup is based on. And these days, you're more likely to try a competitive title if you're coming from another esport, which is why a lot of Valorant players came from games like CS and Overwatch, rather than having, say, a speedrunning background. However, if you're coming from a different esports game and want to learn how to play Dota or League with no prior experience, you have to learn the very basics, like how to control your character and the camera, in addition to all the tech and know-how that's specific to the title that you're playing. I mean, for the vast majority of people, to play a MOBA, you're gonna have to rewire your brain to believe that movement is controlled by your right hand rather than your left. This illustrates how outdated the very control setup of MOBA games is. Heck, I'm personally friends with a guy that's absolutely cracked in Valorant, but can't play Dota to save his life just because of how non-transferable the skills are. Compare that to going from, say, Overwatch to Valorant, which a lot of pro players in early Valorant did. You only really need to learn how to adjust your sense, and you have the basics down. You can now focus on learning the ins and outs of the game itself. Despite their differences in pace, movement, and abilities, the games really just boil down to shooting the enemies before they can shoot you and accomplishing the objective while doing so. In this sense, the rest of the gaming world has kind of left these games behind. and so have a lot of their players. If you ask any League or Dota player, they'll probably tell you that their respective game peaked during about 2013 to 2017. During this time frame, these games were at their most popular, and this is what the trend websites would suggest. During this era, League champions like Jhin, Ivern, and Yasuo were considered new-ish releases. These were the shiny new toys that everyone wanted to play with, and then there's old Asol that only a handful of people really liked, so they reworked him to be a boring permascaler. On the other side of the MOBAverse, Valve was starting to wrap up with the Dota 1 ports. This was when the player base was reintroduced to heroes like Terrorblade, Arc Warden, Oracle, and of course, Techies. And they were starting to release new heroes that were never in Dota 1 like Monkey King, Pangolier, and Dark Willow. And from a personal standpoint, this was when I was a high school student, and I'm willing to bet that a lot of people got into these games when they were broke students like I was. Mainly because I've been uploading Dota and League content for like the past 6 months, and my numbers tell me this is the case. And the reason for this is that these games were optimized for the people. Dota 2 and League of Legends could run on potatoes. They didn't need fancy expensive graphics cards, nor a controller, and definitely not a PlayStation Plus subscription. I remember running these games on a shitty Sony Vaio laptop that would like 4 GB of RAM and still being able to play just fine. But most importantly, they were free to play. We didn't have to spend money on the new Call of Duty or whatever fancy AAA game just to have a good time with friends. We could just boot up Steam or the League client and then just stay up until 3 AM because we kept saying we can't end on a loss. And these memories of grinding ranked and watching pro games and highlights when I was young really cemented my personal love for these games, and they did too for hundreds of thousands of others all around the world. But those memories were a latter half of a decade ago. The thing with your typical Dota or League match is that they last too long. When a game could last anywhere from 35 minutes to over an hour on average, it's easy to play them when you're a teenager whose only real responsibility is homework. But that's not so much the case when you've got a 9-to-5 job, real life responsibilities, and maybe even a partner and children. And that's why a lot of older players just end up sticking to playing other game modes within the game rather than full-length matches that the game was designed for. Turbo is Dota's retirement home, and as someone who only plays Turbo and has been for the past 30 years at this point, it's a lot more chill and full of older players like myself. Sure, there are still the toxic players every now and then, but mostly it's just people who learn to not care about the ranked grind or just don't have the time or headspace to keep up with the latest competitive meta. What do you mean Mirana's a legit POS 1 carry? Meanwhile, League players who are tired of Summoner's Rift typically only end up playing ARAM, which is such a popular game mode and has a not insignificant number of players dedicated to it that Riot recognizes it as a legitimate mode and has its own separate balance sheet. Otherwise, they play Teamfight Tactics, which I've never played myself because auto battlers simply don't appeal to me. But based on what I've heard, matches are shorter and less mentally exhausting than your typical Summoner's Rift match. And because that game is a solo experience, you don't have to deal with a mystery box that is teammates. Dota and League matches simply take too much time, thus the game's primary audiences simply aged out of playing them. When you're in your 20s and you just get home from work, as fun as these games are, sometimes opening up the game and queuing for a match will just end up feeling like a chore. Other people just want to turn their brains off after an exhausting day, or do more productive things than set aside an hour of their evening to play a video game, like go to the gym or spend time with family. You might disagree though. You might be a diehard Dota League player and still find it in you to grind out games even when you're starting to experience the years catching up to you. And if that's the case, more power to you. But you may have a friend that you used to queue up with and they moved on from the game, and playing the game just doesn't feel the same without them. My friends who I used to play League with aren't playing League anymore because they moved on to more fulfilling hobbies. They're running marathons, going rock climbing, and even starting families. That's something that I've noticed a lot of players feel when it comes to these games. You might still enjoy the games themselves, and anyone who's played them will tell you that they're infinitely more fun with friends or in a stack, but even getting another to play with seems even more challenging in this day and age. And the players that do set aside time to play video games still are spoiled for choice now. A lot of people who played League and Dota only really gravitated towards the games because there was nothing else to play that was free at the time. I mean, Team Fortress 2 was there, but it didn't quite scratch that competitive itch for a lot of people, and some people just didn't like the cartoonish art style. Hearthstone was a card game and thus from genre alone wasn't the most popular. Rocket League was a niche game too. CSGO existed, but it wasn't free to play yet, and neither was Overwatch. There's one more thing to factor in, and it's that, well, the people who played Dota and League during their golden years all have money now. They have the money to get real gaming PCs and to buy all the AAA games that they wanted to play when they were younger, but couldn't because of lack of funds or due to system requirements. So now Dota and League are trying to retain their longtime audience against the very AAA games that they outpriced back in the day due to their free-to-play model. And you know how I said the rest of the gaming world left these games behind? Yeah, about that. Since these games were in the spotlight, a ton of new innovations happened in the PC gaming space. Suddenly, PC building was no longer something that was only for the elite. System components that used to cost a fortune, like RAM and quality SSDs, were suddenly dropping in price and became a lot more affordable. That meant that it was possible to acquire decently powerful systems that were strong enough to handle newer titles without having to break the bank. And now, free-to-play games became the industry standard, ironically due to the success of League's monetization model and Dota's invention of the Battle Pass system. They ironically set the meta that allowed their own competitors to rise up and take up market share. Then all of a sudden, a bunch of other companies wanted in on that free-to-play pie. Now there are a ton of popular esports titles that all released free-to-play, like Valorant and Apex Legends. And that's not even considering the games that went free-to-play in the time since Dota and League were at their peak. Off the top of my head, there's Counter-Strike, Overwatch, PUBG, and probably the biggest one, Fortnite Battle Royale. Even non-esports titles started to go free-to-play, further diluting the accessible game market, namely MMOs like Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars 2, and Destiny 2. Suddenly, gamers didn't have to pay $40 to $60 upfront costs for a multiplayer gaming experience with their friends, and people who just wanted to play a video game became spoiled for choice. If you wanted to play a competitive, free-to-play game, Dota and League were no longer the only options. And those were just the games that were taking off with Western audiences. Here in Southeast Asia, mobile gaming took off because you just didn't need to spend on an entire system to play games, and while a lot of people like to laugh at mobile games and treat them as not real games, I think these prejudices are from a bygone era from when the best mobile games were Subway Surfers, Angry Birds, and the absolute GOAT that is Jetpack Joyride. God, that music still slaps. Mobile games have evolved so much since a decade ago to the point where denying their legitimacy as competitive titles is just foolish. Regardless of how you feel about mobile games themselves, the rest of the world has recognized that mobile gaming is a legitimate market worth tapping into. It's why games like MOBA Legends are taking off as legitimate esports. It's why Hoyo struck a gold mine in creating fleshed-out gacha games optimized for the mobile experience like Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail. It's why brands like Call of Duty and PUBG invested so much into the mobile gaming market. Mobile gaming has become so massive and accessible that there's even less of a reason for people in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, India, and yes, the Philippines, to play games like Dota and League. And these games used to have such a strong cultural foothold within these countries. But that's the topic for another video. Anyway, if that's not enough proof for you, Riot themselves recognized the legitimacy of the mobile gaming space and wanted in, thus creating TFT Mobile and, of course, Wild Rift. Which leads me to my next point, and it's finally time for me to talk about the games themselves. Here's one of my more controversial takes for the video. Wild Rift is a better game than League of Legends. The graphics are better, the game runs more smoothly, it has exclusive skins with cool animations that you can actually preview before buying, and a motherfucking Hextech T-Rex. And this is all because the game is better from a purely technical standpoint, because Wild Rift's code was built from the ground up, allowing you to do things that League of Legends spaghetti code simply can't allow. For example, don't you think that in 2024, it's criminal that you only really get to see the splash art of the skin that you're buying in League? You don't even get an in-game preview of the skin you'll spend real-world money on, and you have to check out the skin on a channel on YouTube just to see the animations and what they look like in-game? It's crazy to me that such a successful game still has that limitation, going on 15 years after its initial release. And don't even get me started with the problems with League's client hurting the overall experience, with things like summoner spells and runes and lane changes not being reflected before queuing up a match, crappy loading times, and just a poor client experience in general. And to the Dota elitists thinking that the other game is so much better, don't worry, I'll be trashing Dota's horrible experience as well. Dota 2's client is so horrendously unoptimized, it's crazy. I have an R5 3600 and a goddamn RTX 3070, and yet I'm averaging like 80 frames to 100 per second, which is lower than what I would get when I play Red Dead Redemption 2, which was released 6 years later and is graphically superior in every single aspect. How the fuck am I getting lower frames in a game from 2013? And then we get to your visual bugs like Bald Wind Ranger, Naked Dragon Knight, various replay gameplay bugs, and the absolute skullfuckery that was the Hand of Midas debacle of 2024. And those are the bugs that you'll be lucky to get if you can even find a match with a game coordinator that likes to disappear more than Joel Embiid in an elimination game. Their last real refresh was about 2014 to 2015, but since then it's only been map changes, updates, and individual remodels for certain heroes and champions. These games are in desperate need of a retouch, but I highly doubt Riot nor Valve would have the stomach to give these games the deep cleaning that they need. There's no way in hell they'll be able to recreate the games with how much bloat they've accumulated over the years with so many skins and characters, because it would just take too long. And attempting an update would cause the games to bleed money and players, so they have to stick to the unoptimized messes that they are. I've got to give props to Smite in this regard. It's incredibly ambitious for the devs to attempt to create Smite 2 with a new engine and update a lot of skins and models. Still not gonna play it though. But returning to my original point, these games were built to run on potatoes back in 2014, and now a decade later, they run like potatoes from 2014. So we have the games aging, people aging out of the games, and new players choosing other, better games because of a huge competition pool. But now we get to the biggest reason people cite as the reason why Dota and League are dying. And that's the MOBA learning cliff. The MOBA genre is incredibly unique. It's probably closest to the RTS in terms of playstyle, but it has evolved to have its own elements independent of its roots. There's just a bunch of individual skills that a player has to learn that no other game has, like wave state management, when to farm creeps, when to farm jungle, when to gank, when to utilize item timings and levels, and a lot more. Like I said, if you're coming from a completely different esport, you're already gonna have to learn how to manage your movement and camera, while also having to learn how to use all your goddamn buttons. And those are just the things that you have to learn to play MOBAs in general. If you want to learn a specific MOBA, you have to learn the game's mechanics, pacing, the items, and the game's ever-growing rosters. And with both Dota and League having over 100 different heroes and champions either way, that's no easy task at all. Heck, I've been playing these games for years, and even I learned a few things after going through every single character's respective kits for my Dota series. The games are hard, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to get into them. After all, these games once dominated the conversation when it came to PC gaming, and these games never really had a good tutorial either. But you know what game had complex mechanics and is growing every year with even more mechanics that are never explicitly stated to the player? Minecraft, aka the most popular game in history. And the reason why is because of Minecraft's incredibly large community. You always either had a friend or set of friends to teach you how to play, or a YouTube tutorial on how to do things that are never explicitly taught to you in game, like how to get to the nether or how to breed villagers. In that same vein, we probably had friends who were good at the game and brought us in and taught us the basics, or if they weren't good, we at least had the shared trauma of learning how to lane with them, or there were content creators putting out content specifically tailored for new players. But these days, it feels impossible to be able to play a game with those friends who first brought us in, just because life gets hectic, and the games have changed and introduced so many new things that those guides that first got us started, while still true on certain fundamental points, feel outdated. And this leads me to perhaps the point that I personally feel is the saddest: the death of the casual MOBA player. Bouncing off the topic for content of MOBAs, let's talk about the drastic shift in the style of content that's made for these games over the years. When Dota and League were at their peak, there was all kinds of content being made for the game. There were highlights for pro matches, guides for ranked sweats, and meta discussions for sure, but there was also a lot of casual content for the games. I'm talking about meme videos, off-meta builds, lore discussions, and simply content oriented towards players that don't take the game too seriously. These are like the classic Dota meme videos that created community jokes that are still quoted to this day, like never going full agi or Kotol give me mana. And for League, this was when content creators like Donkey were still making League videos. Somewhere along the line though, that kind of content disappeared and YouTube started pushing a lot more ranked content, how to climb ranks, hero and champion tier lists and rankings, high rank stream highlights, and more. And while this is good for the ranked sweats who play the game, when this is the only kind of content that's getting pushed, it's easy to forget that these games are also supposed to be fun. And they did their trick. The average player now probably has better fundamentals and a better understanding of the games than the average player 10 years ago. While you can argue that this makes for higher quality matches, this also makes the game experience incredibly boring. Now, there's a right way to play the games, and anyone who doesn't play the games in such a way is branded as trolling. And this has culminated in the death of the casual Dota and League player. I mean, seriously, how are you supposed to enjoy these games casually given the astronomical learning curve and the pressure from wannabe pro players to keep up with the game's meta? To their own detriment, these games have been figured out. I mean, Dota is experiencing the tank meta where nobody fucking dies after a 30-second fight, and this has debatably existed for years ever since Wraith Pact was introduced and subsequently taken out of the game, whereas League's pro meta has honestly been pretty stale for a while now. I mean, when was the last time an AD assassin like Zed was a legitimate pick in the mid lane at the highest level? The casual player doesn't care about the meta. They just want to play their favorite hero or champion. But because of their apathy towards the most effective tactic available, they're subjected to being flamed by teammates, multiple losses against people who do care about the meta, or both, and neither are fun to experience. And while the meta only really matters at the highest levels of play, the wannabe pro tryhard sweats are omnipresent and quite common. I mean, just the other day, I had someone flame me for picking Venge mid in an unranked game. It's a travesty that one of Dota's very selling points as a game is that anything can work, and yet you're socially forced to play under the rules of people who are vastly superior in terms of skill level. And this wouldn't be such a problem if keeping up with the meta didn't take so much time on its own. You need to watch videos and streams, pro match highlights, or even check out stat websites just to make sure that you're picking someone that fits in the meta, despite not even necessarily enjoying that character. It just leads to insane burnout for the player base, and even I get stressed thinking about it. So with an aging game and player base, difficulty in acquiring and retaining new players, and just more competition from other games in general, what's the reality behind Dota and League's downfall? Well, it's vastly overstated. What, did you think this was a doom posting video? I mean, I guess it kinda is, illustrating the points that make Dota and League a hard sell in 2024, but the games aren't dead, at least not yet. You can still log into either game right now and very easily find a match in a few minutes at most, assuming you're a member of the vast majority of the player base that isn't in higher level lobbies. League of Legends is still a titan in the industry and is a household name currently. I mean, well, yeah, the game has a reputation for being a toxic cesspool, but the thing is, the game has a reputation. That means it's still talked about and is still socially relevant. The fact that I still see memes on TikTok and on my Instagram reel about people saying, "Don't date a League player," kinda just shows how League is still popular despite all the things it has going against it. And while I did complain about the overall meta previously, because of the domination of champions like Corki, pro teams are forced to innovate and pick whack drafts to try and deal with these kinds of picks. Just a few weeks ago, we got a Nasus versus Garen mid matchup in a professional match, and this isn't happening in some garbage region like NA, but this was in the LCK between DK versus MSI winners and would-be Golden Road hopefuls Gen G. Dota, on the other hand, is a different story. It's never been as popular as League of Legends simply because of how much more complex the game is because of so many more mechanics and hidden tech. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but complexity doesn't make the game better. But because of how complex the game is, the Dota fanbase is far and away the more dedicated one. Seriously, Dota 2 fans are so insanely obsessed with the game that I don't think they'll let it die out as long as they live. And yet I've never seen such a whiny player base. So many people cry about the game being dead and not having any updates, when in the past 2 years, we've had 2 enormous changes like the new Frontier map and the introduction of innates and facets. The thing with Dota is that it feels like it knows it's on the decline, and instead of trying to fight the signs of the times, the devs aren't trying to attract new players, but instead trying to keep the current ones happy. For example, Valve did a huge crackdown on Smurf accounts, third-party software, and account buyers. They removed the incredibly predatory Battle Pass model and gave the community an amazing event in Crownfall, which lets you get a ton of free sets, a discount on 2 brand new Arcanas, which is the ultimate skin equivalent for you League players, and even a chance at some of the old ones. In both cases, though, the player bases have stopped growing and have overall stabilized. There aren't too many new players coming in, at least not compared to when these games were in their heyday, and while people are playing less and some people are dropping them entirely, Dota and League have evolved to become more seasonal games. People play these games for a few weeks, then ignore them for a while, coming back to try out new updates or when a friend wants to play, and then the cycle just keeps going like this. And this is a trend that's present in both games. Player numbers month over month are up and down, thus fluctuating based on the update, meta, month, and changes in the overall gaming space. And anyone who's played either of these games can attest to this. You don't really just stop playing these games, whether it be due to sunk cost or simply addiction. There's just something magical about these games that keeps people coming back. As the saying goes, you don't quit, you just take longer and longer breaks. I see it in real life with my interactions with friends who used to play these games a lot, and I get a ton of comments on my videos of people itching to come back to both Dota and League just after seeing how these games have changed over the years and more. And something still worth mentioning about these player charts though. As stable as they are now, they are undeniably trending downwards. And that's simply because of the many reasons I've listed above. The games are old, the players are aging out of it, and new players are going to other, more modern, more culturally relevant games rather than these dinosaurs from over a decade ago. The downfall of Dota and League is inevitable. Nothing is meant to last forever, after all. The trends don't lie, their days are numbered and their golden years are long gone, but these games are not going away anytime soon. Dota 2 is still one of the top 5 most played games on Steam, and League of Legends is Riot's biggest cash cow. There's no way they're letting that game die out in the foreseeable future. But when they eventually do die, their influence on not just the MOBA genre, but the entire gaming landscape as a whole cannot be understated, and while these games may eventually be gone, they will not be forgotten for their innovations alone. And when they do die, the MOBA genre as we know it will go with them. Because the genre needs to evolve past Dota and League. Dota and League as they are currently are simply old-timers in an era of Zoomers. They are showing their age, and the fact that they're having difficulty in attracting new players shows this. If these games die, the rest of the MOBA genre follows. Thus, there needs to be a new face to the genre, with new changes and innovations, and ways to address the issues mentioned in this video and more. The face of the modern MOBA could be right around the corner, and it's called Deadlock. And as someone who has had the privilege of playing it, my god, is it fun. But that's the topic for the next video. And if you don't want to miss it, be sure to leave a like, a comment, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Every little bit of engagement helps the channel out in more ways than one, so if you want me to keep making videos like this one, I'd appreciate it. That's all for now, and ace out.